today's topic is effective API integration with the kind of slant of a technical viewpoint, because I think you can look at it from multiple angles, and we're going to pick a slightly technical viewpoint for this. What I do want to do is also acknowledge the panel that will help me present some of the slides and have a bit of a discussion and on this, which is Brad. He heads up the MuleSoft practice for Banking in Capgemini FS. Gil Perry, co-founder at Corps. Hari Krishna, senior consultant Capgemini. Lakshmi, solution architect at Amex. Tejas, solution architect at TUI. Vaughan, co-founder at CodHub. So thank you guys for joining me. I know we spent quite a bit of time last week to form this together, so it's good. So just want to set some context and then kind of go through APIs and semantics, how we think about kind of development velocity and kind of patterns and pitfalls. That's what it is. The key thing to keep in mind is, how does anything or any of the context or any of the recommendations or suggestions, whatever you call it, how does it apply to you? So, you know, a lot of what is discussed in APIs is very context specific, and the panelists will hopefully go into some of this to say, you know, what are some of the trade-offs that you might want to be making as you're making kind of design decisions or making delivery of APIs, if you like. And also the context changes based on your role, you know, how you view things and what you want to get from APIs changes. And also the size and scale of the projects that you're working on and the APIs also have an influence on some of the things that we talk about. So what are some of the things that affect an effectiveness of an API? So if you think about sponsors and businesses, you know, they're typically sold on the value of APIs, and, you know, typically MuleSoft does a really good job of selling values of, you know, the 3 tiers, etc. But that puts a little bit of a burden on us as technologists, you know, because you've got to deliver on that promise. And the challenges we face are kind of multi-layered, if you like. You've got macro level challenges, you've got micro level challenges, and they're very multi-dimensional. And as technologists, we have to kind of, you know, really manage these, and we'll get into a little bit of those and hopefully, you know, draw up some experiences from the community as well. So typically a big API program, you know, we launch and there's a big celebration, hurrah, we're going to build APIs and we're going to make them public and we're going to monetize them, etc. And then we start. So really, what I want to do is get a feel for what people think are some of the biggest influence on the ineffectiveness of APIs. So we just launched a poll, so if everyone can vote, I'll give everyone some time. So it looks like quite a few people think, you know, time pressure in terms of deadlines have an effect. Inefficient experience or knowledge. Nobody's picked wrong technology, so everyone's obviously picking the right technology, which is great. Too big of a scope. Inefficient governance. That seems to be the clear winner there in terms of what people think, with 26 people or 43% voting for that. Common goals across teams and one other. So I think that's an interesting result in the sense that the community thinks, you know, governance is a critical issue, and maybe that's a potential topic that we might want to cover in the future. So why are some API programs technically ineffective? You know, APIs have existed for a while now. You know, people will remember SOA or even before that in terms of, you know, copybooks or, you know, Java objects and things being passed around and various things like that. So it's not that technologies are unfamiliar with kind of exposing APIs. To be effective, I think you need to look at APIs through a kind of a value angle in terms of immediate value and what value it provides over time. You also want to think of APIs as being predictable to consume and to implement. And it also needs to be flexible to extend, right? And again, this is from a technical viewpoint. There are probably other things that, as the poll showed, there are other things that influence building an effective API or publishing an effective API. So as developers and as architects, what are some of the things we can do? One of the things to think about is, semantics before schematics, if you like. In my experience, a lot of folks just think about APIs as passing data around, right? They don't really think about, okay, an API needs to represent a user group's mental model, and it needs to be modeled after the business and what the business might want to do with those kind of resources or objects, etc. One example of this is, a lot of places I go build system APIs, but actually, if the system API doesn't provide a level of abstraction, then actually there isn't much value in building that additional layer, if you like. Maybe the system API is making multiple backend calls, so it's maybe wrapping an underlying system and providing a level of abstraction or context that's relevant to the organization. A consumer shouldn't really need to know the technical details, if you like. So that's one of the key things.
Just on your previous slide, if you go back to your previous slide. So I think when you say semantics, I don't know, at least in my experience, if we start thinking about the semantics and build our APIs or design our APIs, so we might end up in a more fine-grained APIs, right? So and then we have the challenge of, okay, when we have to build that process layer, we're having to integrate with more than one system APIs at that level, if that makes sense, right? So now if you start thinking in that semantics level, it really made sense to just create that system API for one kind of a boundary or one functional boundary. But eventually, as your system grows, you may have to revisit that, right? So it's not always true, is my opinion, but yeah.
So let me make sure I understood what you're saying. Are you saying that if you build granular APIs, it becomes more of a challenge to build because you've got proliferation of APIs and there's more APIs and you have to manage? Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it comes down to the semantics. There is a bit more that we cover later on in these slide decks, but I think it's good to cover some of it now. When you think about the semantics, it's less about whether they're fine-grained or coarse-grained, and it's more about what the user's mental model is. Because the user's mental model might only have 4 or 5 objects that they're working with. So, if you're banking, for example, it's a bank account, it's transactions, it's, payments in, foreign currency exchange, it's those kind of things. If it's insurance, it's a quote, it's a policy, it's a claim. So it's about how do you represent those as kind of resources, and how do you make those consumed? And those things underneath might go into multiple systems, and that's why you need fine-grained, APIs to begin with. But in terms of when a business user comes to you and ask questions, they're normally talking about a policy or a claim or whatever it may be, if that makes sense. So that's what we mean there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think that's why I wanted to make it clear, to say, okay, it's not always just think about a specific value, right? But I think you'll have to talk about what the business needs, and then as you rightly said, it's about identifying those domains or entities as well.
You're absolutely spot on, and that's the value that I think we need to build, which kind of nicely comes on to this, which is, you mentioned the term domain. So an abstracted API might provide a domain response. But before I kind of go into the details of this, I know, Vaughan, you have a very strong opinion on what values API should bring, and wrapping underlying systems and some, let's say, anti-patterns, etc. you've seen. Can you share some of your thoughts on this?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think I do have fairly strong opinions insofar as I strongly believe that APIs are more than just technical tools, but represent or should represent and deliver business value. Now, there are different benefits you can get from an API. You can have an API at a technical level that is talking to a system and that you can call and you can get some data. And that's great. I'm not saying there's no value to that. But we've had APIs. APIs have been around, for over a decade now. We talk about REST APIs and that kind of thing. And for me, APIs need to fulfill a bigger value. And for me, it's always kind of looking at the business first. And I think as developers, very often there is a disconnect between developers and what the business needs. And I think, Lakshmi, you hit the nail on the head when you said you need to look at the bigger picture. And there needs to be, when you look at an API, there should be, the domain you're working in should be reflected back to you at some level. I've seen APIs where that have basically just wrapped a third-party product with a very, very granular API. And it's an ex-client of mine basically wrote something that called that very granular API, but in effect was tightly coupled to it. So there was no abstraction. And what that meant was, even though there was something that internal services could call that kind of offered a kind of slightly more or less granular API, the result was every time the underlying API changed, this is the third-party API changed, the granular API, all of the clients had to change as well. And I think that when you're looking at APIs, you should be looking at what are the business, what are we trying to achieve, not what is the other side of the APIs. From a business perspective, what is this doing and what value does it provide going forward, when not during this project that you're working on, but in 6 months' time or a year's time, when you need to change something, when the business needs to change, needs to evolve, does that API stand the test of time? It's very easy to write a technical API that works. It's much harder to write an API that can be composed into new business processes and represents the business and the business objects and the business resources. And I think that that's really important for me, is that the value over time is not in making it work technically, but in being able to reuse it, and it being a building block in composing new business processes very easily and quickly. And that's where the real value for me lies. I don't know if that answers your question, Jay.
No, it does, and hopefully it probably reiterates some of the points Lakshmi made. I don't know, Lakshmi, if you've got anything else you wanted to add there.
I think that's all I wanted to say, because it's very easy for us when we start designing the APIs to just focus on one specific task that's on the hands, but then it's very important to understand the domain or the bigger picture of why you're building that. Yeah.
One thing that hasn't been covered is that often business domain experts think of the back-end systems when we're getting knowledge from them, and often there are business processes put in place that are actually affected by the underlying system itself. And that is something that's actually very, very difficult to get the business domain experts to abstract away from.
Yeah, which is great, because that kind of brings us to the next slide. Yeah, so I guess it's a challenge of who should be writing some of those API specs, and you've put business users, and especially if the business users are technically savvy, then they might want to have a go at writing some of the specifications themselves. And I know, Brad, you've got a view on, and so does many other people on this call. in terms of who should be writing some of these API specification and who should be modeling those, because I've seen projects where data modelers have done it, architects have done it, you've had very specific API designer roles, etc. So Brad, maybe you could share some of your thoughts on building API specifications and who should be doing those.
Yeah, I think, and I guess it's worth just calling out, what we mean by API specification. I guess it's interchangeable sometimes between documentation and API design itself. So I guess for me, it's about the specification here, which ultimately is the contract that leads to the implementation itself. So that's how I interpret the specification itself. And I think there's two things I thought when you posed this question to me, when we were discussing it last week. I think there's two things. I think it's getting the right person, as you highlighted. So quite often it may not necessarily be the domain expert that's in the room. I mean, typically these events will happen through some sort of event storming or some sort of design workshop, and that will be multiple people that are involved in that. But I'm not quite sure sometimes, particularly if you're looking at it from a spec-driven perspective, that we actually are able to benefit from some of the tools that are available to us. For example, I know in my experience, we certainly don't maximize the tool set that's in front of us through the Mule solution itself. So it's a combination of it having that business domain expert, and not just having the dev that can, necessarily drive the tools in the background after the workshop. And I don't, in my experience, I'd be interested to see and call out as well. I don't see the interactiveness of design happening during those workshops, Jay. I think in my experience, we're still very much, particularly on the larger programs, we document it some way, be that a whiteboard scribble, which is probably the best way, or worst case, if it's written, recorded in some sort of notes or something somewhere in minutes, and we try and pull that back and turn that into an actual, an API spec itself. I don't see us actually capitalizing on some of the tools that are available to us.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm probably a culprit of scribbling stuff on whiteboards and then running.
But I think that's much better, isn't it? Because at least that visually interprets it. In an ideal world, yes, we'd be all sitting there and we literally have a designer sitting there in the background, writing up RAML as we spoke. I'm no expert when it comes to the API design itself, and I'm not convinced always we put that right person in that role. So I think the tools are there. In various guises, the tools are there. I mean, API Ops is a big, well, sorry, not a big, but it's a recent thing I've been picking up on. Again, that's taken it, I guess, from design and actually implemented it all the way through the delivery cycle itself. So that's an interesting space, I think, to be looking at as well.
Yeah, it does. And it sounds like you've been watching too many Kong webinars as well, Brad.
That distracted. Yeah, well, but I mean, the guys in Scandinavia have been talking about this stuff for a while. Never get time to look at it, but yeah, it's piggybacking off some of those sort of conversations that are happening in the background. So it's to be frank, quite refreshing not to have necessarily the Mule slant of the designer view. But I know, for example, and I'd be interested, even designer. In my experience, we're not using it aggressively. Unfortunately, we've got the suite of tools that we don't necessarily piggyback off of.
No, I agree, and actually, I think it's a good point that you make, that you probably need a team to build it, because different people are concerned about different levels of detail and granularity. Because I typically start off with a logical data model, and then that gets translated into a Swagger or RAML specification, if you like. Because you want to make sure you've captured the right events or the right resources, etc. So I think that makes sense.
Just a thought to share,
yeah, please.
In one of our recent projects with Amex, right? So I don't know, so at least I did not have this experience with the behavior-driven development, right? So the BDD kind of tests. So I can see clearly, because these are the tests, the BDD tests are written by the product owners, like the likes of BAs or the designs, and then the testing team gets involved with them. So I can very clearly see now that any requirement or capability or feature where there is BDD written, so there's no technical jargons, there's no if and else in terms of, okay, my API send this parameters request and then I should get this response, not that. It's more a business language, right?
Yeah.
To say, if I am listening to this event and I expect an outcome of that, these are the things that needs to happen. So I have seen writing those tests and then making them part of your build cycle to make sure that, you know, all your build that you're doing aligns with that kind of requirement is very good, you know, a kind of ensuring, very good way in terms of ensuring what the business owner or the product owner needs is what we have developed, and rather than we being in tandem, right? So probably a topic for us to discuss, you know, by itself, BDDs.
Yeah. Probably to add further, maybe Jay, right? Behavioral driven. Apart from that, there's event driven as well, right? So if you put that metrics on top of this, because APIs are now the drivers behind most of these new communications and exchanges going on across channels, across companies, across enterprise. So I think that is also a good parameter to add.
Completely agree.
In the chat as well, Supriya says, would like to see the difference between domain response and technical response with some examples. Could you help me on this?
Oh, that's good, because that's the next slide, I think. So we got one more poll before I answer that question. And this is about, you know, just naming resources for APIs. You know, I want to gauge where, if people think it's easy, very easy, etc., and go from there.
I would say that it's very easy if there is actually good domain knowledge. If there's not good domain knowledge, it can be very problematic and create a big mess in terms of how the API ends up getting used.
Absolutely, and I think this, I've just shared the poll, so this is obviously a very close topic for a lot of people, and just looking at the time, because we do want to try stick to time. We might not be able to cover all the topics we want, but I'm happy for this session to kind of flow into the next meetup, if you like. So 37% find it hard and 47% find it okay. So that's kind of interesting. So I think there are some people who obviously find it very natural for them. So we'll see that. I don't know if people have heard the term reification. You know, this is really about a term where you take an abstract concept and you make it physical. You know, what you got to bear in mind is APIs are about communication. So you've got to make the communication predictable. I don't mean predictable in the sense of kind of TCP or at that level, but if you say, here's a resource, as a human, I expect to be able to manipulate this resource with a particular set of operations. And again, I think it goes back to what Lakshmi was saying about behavioral driven design and what some of the expectations of a particular actions are. I think CRUD APIs are really easy to align with, but you know, when you're starting to do business services, I think it becomes really hard. And I think when you're especially starting to have business services that are starting to do lots of orchestration, it becomes even so hard. And really you're talking about, you know, nounification of abstract resources. So consumers can kind of predict what the REST verbs will mean for a particular, you know, a noun. So here's a sort of an example, a good example and a bad example, if you like. So Gil, maybe, you know, before we kind of jump into the example, maybe you can share how you learned this and how this helps you do some of the API design, if you like, Gil.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jay. I'll take it into two separate things. So in terms of experience, how I learned this, so I guess that would be a few years ago now, where I came across the concept of reification when doing some architecture and design work for a big broadcaster. So used to sort of specifying APIs for dev teams, and a lot of the time that's fairly trivial, as some people put on the easy part and the okay part. But actually, when you're trying to align with something like business processes or workflow, it can become sort of much harder to reason about, in my experience anyway. So that was the situation I was finding myself in for a series of broadcast APIs that aligned with business capabilities. And I ended up sort of tying myself in knots a bit And during that time, I had the opportunity to speak to Dan North, and he introduced me to sort of the concept of reification, which, as you alluded to, Jay, was basically making something abstract real, effectively, a nounification of resources. And with that, you can pretty much realize any resource. You can resourceify anything and make new words, apparently. So, in fact, in its simplest form, well, often that's a matter of like switching the verb and then noun around, and all of a sudden it becomes more kind of restful and you can think about it better. But it's much more powerful than that. In terms of design and maybe has it simplified it, maybe, I think probably the answer to that is yes, and no, and maybe, because to me it's just another tool in the box, really. So that you can use about when you're designing APIs. So there's no kind of silver bullet here. There's no one size fits all. You can utilize several strategies that you can leverage depending on the scenario. I think the important thing is whatever API, whether it's a business API or a CRUD, whatever it is that it's expressive. So the intent is very clear, and reification can help it in that scenario. So I'm not sure if reification has simplified my design at all, because I was probably still agonize about what makes an API good. But at least you're clear on what the options are available. So like I say, it's another tool. I think it can help simplify operations on a resource. So if you're trying to do coarse-grained stuff, sometimes things can be too coarse-grained, but by having reification, actually, it aligns to more kind of business resources, and that can make the intent clearer. So you're not trying to, post something which has different behavior based on the different properties that you provide in your request, and then trying to reason about that whole thing itself requires business domain knowledge by the actual person who's doing the request, and conversely, being able to infer that in the receiver. That it can help simplify the operation of the resource, but there's also the risk of resource proliferation as well if you go down a reification route. So you've got to just take things on a case-by-case basis and be pragmatic.
Yeah, and I think it goes to the example here. It's about finding that noun-verb combination that's expressive enough to do what you want within a particular domain, but actually not going so far that every single field in a JSON object is now suddenly a resource that can be modified and objected, and that's taking it too far. So I think it's striking the balance, and it's also, again, going back to kind of the user group's mental model and how they want to manipulate and what actions and operations they want to take. A lot of people do that for UI, but not necessarily for APIs, and I think that's important. I've put up an example here in terms of triggering some sort of job to happen, and you can have a cancel trigger and trigger the timer to start, etc. Or you can just say, here's a time trigger, and I want to be able to create an instance of that time trigger, and I want to be able to cancel it, pause it, etc. So again, I know this is a naughty example, but at least it helps to kind of serve the purpose.
Jay, just one other additional comment on that, and you don't have to go down this route, but if you do it in this way, the payloads that you tend to send are smaller, and the intent, the actual kind of look of them is much more like an event. So if you do want to go down the route of doing event sourcing and build up that state via something like CQRS, stuff like that, then it's another good route to take. It's not always, you don't have to go down that route, but it gives you that kind of option.
Yeah, and it's a modeling language that kind of comes in from all angles, and again, expressiveness of the model that you're building, if you like, which is key. So, the user story for this might be something as simple as, as the user, I want to schedule or start a job, I want to cancel the job, but again, I want to ask Vaughan this, because even coming up with these user stories, we shouldn't really look to the business to tell us what it is they want, because a lot of times they don't know what it is they want, and we need to kind of help guide them, etc. So Vaughan, are you able to share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can give it a bash. So in an ideal world, you would want the business to tell you what they want. In 20 years of doing this, I've never found a client that knows exactly what they want. They know what they're trying to achieve at a very high level in the business. And they do rely on technologists and architects and developers to make a lot of decisions around what that looks like. Now, what that means for me is that as architects, as developers, we have a big responsibility to understand what it is that the business wants. And the only way that's ever achieved is by spending time with the business and understanding what it is that they're doing, what they want to achieve. Too many times I've seen projects where the business comes to a development team and says, we need to do this, we need an API. They've heard about APIs, like you said before, they've probably been sold in terms of the project that an API is going to deliver value. But then it's left up to the technologists, to develop that API. And I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that what we're doing is meeting the longer term requirements of the business. And that's quite hard to do because in most projects, the poll earlier asked, why do API, deliver less value than expected? Time pressures are definitely one of those. So development teams are asked we need an API, we need it now, it needs to work. And they spend a lot of their time just trying to understand the basic requirements and then trying to implement that. And very often that bridge, that alignment with the strategic business objectives is altogether lost. And my view is that it doesn't matter what kind of API that you're writing, you should always be able to map it to some kind of business requirement outside of the technical domain. So I guess that's a long way of saying, while in an ideal world, the business would say, this is exactly what we want. The business very generally don't understand the technology, and too often the technologists don't understand the business, and we need to bring those two things together, and collaboration is really important. I think Brad covered it as well on an earlier slide, where you need to have the right people at the right point having discussions, because if the developers understand what it is that they need to do, not just at a technical level, but the business value they can deliver, and they get that up front, and then it's much easier to deliver. If you are too focused on delivering something technical, very often then it's much harder to go back and go and add the business value, the bigger, more strategic business value. So we need to do the right things at the right times, I think, is how I would summarize that.
I think there's definitely a theme of a thin blue line, right, from the requirements up front, getting your design right, implementation. It's I guess why DDD come along and try to help focus us and build on that. Yeah,
absolutely. Any other questions from the audience or the community?
I was just going to say, Jay, so I know it's easier to say it's a noun, identify the nouns, and that's how your resources should be named, verbs. But I think when you actually start working, I think this is true with one of our projects that we work together on DLG, isn't it? So where it was really difficult to name those APIs, have the right resources for them, the naming conventions and things like that, because we had a lot of other dependencies in terms of how we were grouping those APIs that they're deployed into a specific cluster, right? So yeah, so it's easier said, just use nouns, verbs. There's always those standards, but yeah.
It is, and this next slide is really to emphasize on the point you've just made, Lakshmi, because maybe the right verb isn't timed triggers, it's schedules. We don't, so you have to start thinking about, well, what fits the user's mental model. Maybe schedules are the thing that is in the business user's head, and that's how the business thinks about what they want to do. So maybe schedules are better, and maybe the time trigger is the technical fine grain API, and if you were to abstract that away, schedules might be the appropriate terminology. So maybe you've got a system of record that things in time triggers, but your business uses things about schedules. So maybe schedules is the abstraction that the the system API needs to provide. So those are some interesting comments, etc. So in terms of where we are with the topics, we're probably about 1/3 through. What I think is worth doing is just starting off the next topic, because I do think it's interesting, but maybe we break there and we leave about 5 minutes for kind of questions. And you've got 2 teams, if you like, so let me set up some context here. Imagine that for a change request, you ask 2 teams to make similar changes to their APIs or product. Team A comes back with half a day estimate. Team B comes back with 4 days estimate. Why do you think that is? Why any sort of thoughts from the audience on this?
Yeah, I can add something. So I think it actually defines what is your definition of done on the story, if I have to track it back to the user story.
Yeah,
you mentioned that let's say I'm developing an API which actually search a policy from the backend and then send it back to the front end to the user. So if I'm writing as a user, I want to search a policy so that the end user can be benefited by looking at the policy information. When I define my definition of done, I really have to see through, am I just making code changes and exposing it to the business? Or am I actually carrying out the quality checks or, the engineering practices like test-driven development, my JUnit pieces, my DDs, like as somebody touched upon, we have those given when then scenarios that have been adequately checked before we actually deploy that into the higher environment. And then peer review is another very common technique or strategy which people tends to have, so that we always have another eye on the code before it gets exposed to the business. So there are a number of checks. So it actually depends. If team B are saying 4 days, when challenged, they may come up with a list of items that needs to be done before that API can be made available. And team A might be just writing a couple of lines of code and just deploying the API in the containers.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, on that one, in terms of the QA, actually, I think high levels of QA actually speeds up development rather than slows it down. And I've seen that happen several times. So it can be a double-edged sword. The other thing is, Team A may not have as much deep experience of what they're trying to implement. Team B may have a better understanding of the underlying ecosystem. So there could be a number of reasons for this. It all could be how people are experienced with the tools and technology they're using and how comfortable they are with the business domain.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
I'd argue the other way around would work as well. It's possible that Team A know exactly what needs to be done, while Team B are in their own learnings. It's possible both ways.
It is possible both ways, yes. They may need more time because they're still learning. Yeah.
I would argue in a different way. So if on a team giving a 2 different estimate for a change, that means in first place that API wasn't designed and implemented properly to the top quality.
That makes sense, Anton. So there's some technical debt that needs to be resolved.
Either it's not properly tested, or it's not properly documented, or the definitions are not clear. It can be anything, yeah. From top to bottom, that can be
Just like technical debt, you could have known gotchas, like a certain piece of work might require an upgrade, a new component, security infrastructure being put in place.
No, I think that makes sense.
And that could change the team there.
Yeah, there could be other changes or other things that are making impacts and other dependencies. Makes sense. What we do have is one more poll. So let's see what other people think of this. So launch the poll. And then after the poll, I think we'll pause there and for the real answer, you're going to have to wait till the next meetup.
I mean, usually in these type of multiple choices, you always have an answer called one is all of above, right? So a combination of these. You're missing that choice though.
Yeah, we are. But it's interesting to think people don't think it's better technology. It's a greenfield site, so greenfield site can be slow.
Somebody named the last one is the VDD. So.
VDD, voodoo-driven design.
The voodoo-driven development.
we might have to trademark that one.
Yeah. But the question is, was the team A did they deliver in the time that they gave, or?
So Lakshmi's got experience of this, and I believe they did. But to hear more, you're going to have to wait till the next meetup. So a lot of people think it's experience and use of patterns. So we will cover the use of patterns slightly later as well. But that's interesting results. I think I just want to thank the panelists that have spoken and some of the panelists that have joined and are waiting for their sections to come up, so they'll have to wait a little bit longer to get the time to shine in the spotlight, if you like.
I just wanted to say thank you for offering yourself up. I know you've obviously always done a fantastic job of facilitating the meetups, and people step forward to share content, and there's people in this meetup now who have shared content before. But just to kick us off for the new year, I appreciate the time and effort that's gone into you bringing that together. So thank you, Jay, on behalf of everybody.
Thank you.